Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Classical Antiquity Sidequest, a podcast covering topics from classical antiquity. The period of time is known for, as Edgar Allan Poe put it, the glory that was Greece, the grandeur that was Rome. Our next side quest will involve the close study of a historical figure who overlapped with Jesus, and the popular understanding of this figure has generally been associated with comparisons to Jesus. I'm talking, of course, about Apollonius of Tyana. I came across him in podcasts and in some scattered references here and there, which led me to engaging in a side quest, if you will, and becoming interested in this figure, and gave me sort of a desire to learn more about him and how his historical reputation came about. To do that, I reached out to Dr. Roshan Abraham, a professor at American University. I was on academia.edu and found an article titled The Biography of a Pagan Saint, Apollonius of Tyana, that I read and thoroughly enjoyed. I would suggest you all subscribe to that website if you have not already, in addition to downloading and reading the article. We discussed that, and we also side quest into DC Comics because it turns out Dr. Abraham has written a great deal about DC Comics and its association with the classics. He edited a book that is out, which I would suggest that you all take the time to go and purchase. The title of the book is Theology in the DC Universe. It came out in 2023. It is definitely on my reading list. For those of you who like the classics but also like comics, I would suggest you all check it out if you have not done so already. Okay, before we get started into this episode, there's one point that I want to make about the discussion that you'll hear regarding the DC Comics character Jonah Hex, and the one origin story that he has as a Confederate soldier who realized he was fighting for the wrong side. As I was editing this, it occurred to me that I didn't fully explain my point well, but the guest for this episode understood what I was talking about and the point that I was making. So I just wanted to make sure that it was clear to people who weren't participants of the conversation. While Jonah Hex is an interesting character in the comics, and there's a lot of stories that would be appealing to tell visually on television, or perhaps in a movie that was, well, can't be worse than that crap fest they made with Josh Brolin. Terrible movie. I don't think, though, that there's really any way you can portray the idea that there is some level of nobility or somebody who was a good person, maybe at their core, who was fighting for the Confederacy. I just don't see how you could possibly do that, given what the Confederacy was about, what it stood for, and what people were fighting to preserve and keep. I just don't see how you could possibly do that. I didn't say all the things I just said in the episode, so I just wanted to add that here so that my thoughts on it are clear. So with that, let's get to the episode. Dr. Roshan Abraham, how are you, sir?
I'm doing pretty well. Enjoying the cold weather.
Yeah, it has seemed to turn of late, surprisingly.
Yeah.
I was telling my kids that it used to be cold for Halloween, and they don't necessarily believe me, but who knows? Well, one thing that we like to do with new first-time guests on the podcast is go through their origin story, basically how each person ended up studying the classics and getting interested in the classics. So,
oh boy, that's
enlighten us, if you will. Yeah,
yeah. It's, I actually have to go back to high school for that. The summer before my senior year, I was part of this program for top high school students, the Kansas Regents Honors Academy, where we were from all around Kansas, and we went to KU for a month. And while I was there, Stanley Lombardo was teaching the kind of core course that we were all taking, which was about astronomy and cosmology and Greek myth. And that's really, I think, what started my interest. I was a fantasy nerd, as a teenager and before. So the stories of Greek myth always had intrigued me. And I ended up going to KU, and I saw that Lombardo was teaching Latin. So I was like, okay, I'll go take Latin first. Um, he's probably best known for his translations of Homer and Virgil and Ovid. Uh, but yeah, so that's where I started taking Latin, and then I started Greek. And by the time I was getting ready to graduate and I decided to apply to graduate school, I was an English and classical languages major and primarily had studied post-colonial Indian literature. But in those last couple of years, I got very much drawn into classics and thinking about classics from what we can call a post-colonial perspective. And I got some good options for graduate school and ended up going to Penn. And then that was a whole trip too. I thought I was going to do Virgilian epic or post-Virgilian epic. I ended up doing Imperial Greek prose and Middle and Neoplatonism. So not exactly where I expected, but just where I ended up as I was following my interests.
Tell us where you work currently. Where are you teaching currently?
Right now, I'm at American University. My full-time position at American University is part of a first-year advising program. I had previously been at WashU in St. Louis as an assistant professor of classics and religious studies. My wife and I had to make the decision after our daughter was born as to whether we're going to let my career decide where we live or things like family. And we decided together that it was much more important for us to be where family is, since they all happen to be in the TC area. And when we moved here, so I committed career suicide by leaving a tenure track position. But when we moved here, I started adjuncting, mostly religious studies. And then I was lucky enough to get the full-time position at AU and still be able to teach adjunct courses in both religious studies and in literature. I'm really excited. Next semester, I'm teaching a course on literary classics, and it's been quite some time since I got to teach the classics. So I'm pretty excited.
What will that course consist of as far as the primary classical texts?
The full title of the course is Literary Classics in the Western Tradition. And I'm always very suspicious of this idea of the West. So I like to look at the classics on their own account. Homer, Virgil, the tragedians, maybe Apuleius if we have enough time. But I also like to look at how they've been received and how they've been used to construct the idea of the West and also to challenge the idea. So I spend some time, my syllabus, we're going to spend some time looking at the use of classics in colonial colonial empires during the 19th century and the 20th century. And we're also going to look at some modern reimaginings of the classics. There's a wonderful graphic novel called In the Infinite Horizon, which retells the story of the Odyssey, but it's set in the 21st century and is about a soldier coming home from Afghanistan. So, it's just a really interesting way to see how the Odyssey still resonates.
The overlap between use of the classics or the antiquity time period and dictatorships, totalitarianism is an interesting topic. And especially having just finished the Gallic Wars recently, I was struck by how this was sort of a modern political biography, thousands of years, 2,000 years ahead of its time. I mean, it was really impressive writing, and you could see how strong men would want to flock to that and utilize it.
And to go along with that, the classics have been very prevalent in alt-right discourses. Unfortunately, we see a lot of appropriation of classics by white supremacists. And it's really around this idea of this greater Western civilization, which is rooted in this kind of white supremacy culture. The idea that Greeks and Romans were somehow the progenitors of the Western Europe and thereby become superior to the rest of world civilization.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think people forget about is how, I don't know if cosmopolitan is the right word, but how diverse ethnically and linguistically the imperial era was. And that's alarming that people just kind of overlook that and just put everybody together in this concept of Roman/white and leave it at that, and don't really understand what they're talking about. But that discussion could go on and should go on for a long time.
Yeah, I'm hoping to have some of that discussion in my class next semester because I love the classics. I love the literature. But I think it's also really important to understand how it gets used for good or for bad.
Correct. Now, and we're going to talk about something much less controversial that will involve lots of comparisons to Jesus, apparently. And that is Apollonius of Tyana, a very famous historical figure who lived right around the same time as Jesus and has been, for some reason, the subject of multiple comparisons to him. So why don't we just jump right in? Why don't you tell us who Apollonius was?
That's a very hard question to answer because our sources are very limited. Most of what we know about Apollonius of Tyana comes from a biography written by Flavius Philostratus in the early 3rd century. And speaking of the cosmopolitan nature of the Roman Empire, he wrote this during the time of Septimius Severus, when Septimius Severus was the emperor of Rome. And there's an emperor who had stronger connections to the East, to Africa, than just Rome and Italy. So since our evidence is primarily from that work, from Philostratus's Life of Apollonius, which was written about 2 centuries after the quote-unquote historical Apollonius, it's hard to really excavate from that who he was in his own time. We only have 2 places where Apollonius is mentioned before Philostratus, and neither of them are positive. But this is one of those places where we have the happenstance of what survives and what doesn't. So all that said, if we try to peel away everything that's fantastical and ideological and encomiastic in Philostratus's biography, we get a picture of a 1st century CE Neo-Pythagorean sage who was probably very similar to the sophists of the 2nd Sophistic. The 2nd Sophistic also being a term created by Flavius Philostratus to refer to the kind of resurgence of Greek rhetoric and Greek philosophy in the Roman Empire. And these sophists would travel around offering philosophy, offering advice to government and leadership, and also just doing these virtuoso performances where they extemporaneously give a speech in the voice of a character from the Iliad, or in these hypothetical what if situations. So Apollonius of Tyana was probably something like that, an itinerant Neo-Pythagorean sage. He probably had relationships with government, whether it be local or imperial. The biography has him encountering a lot of Roman emperors. Um, it's hard to know how historically accurate that is, but it is possible that he had encounters with Roman emperors.
And that's one thing I'm a little, I'd like to explore a little bit more. So I remember hearing about him through podcasts, and I remember something where maybe it was Aurelian said he had a vision from Apollonius at some point, and
Yeah,
Aurelian decided to spare a town based on that.
yeah.
He seemed to be somewhat of a widespread figure, meaning he had some wide geographic reach in the
Mhm.
empire. Can you give us an idea of how broad of a scope maybe his teachings or influence reached geographically?
In his own time, I think, again, we're in a very nebulous area. Um, he was most likely located in uh, Asia Minor and the Eastern Greek Empire himself. But after Philostratus's biography, he really becomes important all over the empire, going into the Islamic empires in the 13th century. Philostratus was a pretty well connected writer. He got the commission to do the biography from Julia Dumna, who is Septimius Severus's wife. So it already had a wide reach. The problem we get into is thinking about where the other sources are and how much of what we read after Philostratus is based on Philostratus, and how much of it is based upon other works that don't survive. We have the names of a few works that don't survive. For example, Maximus of Agi writes a memorabilia of Apollonius, kind of like the memorabilia of Socrates by Xenophon, and that's in the 2nd century. And another individual named Moragenes writes an account of Apollonius, the philosopher and magos, also later in the 2nd century. So there are these other sources of Apollonius. It's possible he had a collection of letters that were circulated, but these were pretty well known throughout the Roman Empire. And you could see it in just the variety of places he shows up. And you mentioned Aurelian, that's in the Scriptoria Historia Augusta, the history of the later emperors of Rome, later emperors of Rome. He comes up in Origen and Eusebius, the church fathers. He comes up in it's called the Great Book of Talismans in Arabic literature, where Apollonius was considered a maker of talismans. Now, I don't know Arabic, so I know less about that. But by then, you're getting into the 13th century. So I would say he was a pretty well-known figure. And the reputation he had, the earlier reputation before Philostratus, was very negative. And Philostratus tries to rehabilitate Apollonius, and he seems to be pretty successful in doing so.
What was
And
the
as you mentioned,
basis?
yeah,
Oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Oh, no, I was
I
going
was
to say, what was the basis for the initial negativity? I read the article that you wrote about him. Was it that they just viewed him as a magician,
Mhm.
or where did that come from?
Right. So we have two authors before Philostratus who mention Apollonius of Tyana. One is Lucian, the satirist from 2nd century CE, and he mentions Apollonius of Tyana in a satirical work called Alexander the False Prophet. And Alexander, this false prophet, uh, according to Lucian in his satire, uh, creates an oracle that's essentially a puppet. Uh, he has a snake puppet that he has talk. Uh, and so he's very much a fraud, very much a con man, right? And in the satire, Alexander's teacher is said to have studied with Apollonius of Tyana. So there's this kind of through line of these con men who focus around ritual, divination, right? That's what the oracles were for. And then we also have him appear in Cassius Dio, talking about the death of Domitian. And in Dio, Apollonius is mentioned as someone who was in Athens, I believe, at the time, but was witnessing the murder of Domitian in Rome. But Dio also says that Apollonius was a magician and a fraud. And the Greek words are important for what Philostratus does. In Greek, there are two words that could be used to refer to a magician. One is the word magos, from which we get like magi, like the three magi from the Gospel according to Matthew. And the other one is goes, which its origin seems to be, that term's origin seems to be related to mourning during funerals. And it gets associated with necromancy and eventually becomes this really, really negative label of someone who is either engaging in dangerous or evil ritual practices or is in some other way a complete fraud, right? And so both Lucian and Cassius Dio refer to Apollonius as both a magos and a goes.
Well, I guess having a vision or prophesying the death of an emperor could not result in a long, secure life for you. That had to be somewhat risky, regardless of whether that's believed. But I'm trying to think of this here. Was he just very influential as far as who he got connected to? I mean, kind of like Rasputin, did he get connected to the right people? I'm not making a comment on whether he was good or bad or anything. Just did he connect himself to the right people?
Right.
Apollonius, and is that why we remember him, or was he just a very kind of like maybe a precursor to the reach that some people get, not me, unfortunately, through podcasts today, that he just had a broad audience that he was able to connect with?
He probably did have a broad audience, but I don't think we can underplay the role Philostratus's biography played in making him more relevant. So, Philostratus is writing in the early 3rd century, and Christianity is developing, spreading during this time. And there's nothing in Philostratus's biography that suggests he was writing in response to Christianity. But Greek and Roman thinkers after him did see in his depiction, in his account of Apollonius, a way to respond to Christian claims about Jesus. Now, those Greek and Roman polemics against Jesus only survive in quotation. So, for example, there is a person named Socianus Hierocles who wrote a 2-volume treatise called The Lover of Truth. And in this treatise, he first talks about contradictions within the New Testament. And if you've read the Gospels closely, it's pretty easy to find those contradictions. But then he goes on to compare Jesus to Apollonius. And he makes the point that Apollonius did all the same miracles Jesus did, but no one considers him a god. We consider him godlike, but we don't make the claim that he is a god. In which is suggesting that, the claim for Jesus as a god is overblown. Because we have our own guy who did the same things.
So he became sort of a spoil, not so much a counter like oh goodness, I can't believe I'm spacing on this, but a spoil saying, well, if you believe this about Jesus, you should also believe this about Apollonius, but not a figure who would actually be worshipped in any fashion.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. He probably was never worshipped. He may have very likely had a kind of philosophical following, and people who emulated his lifestyle. Apollonius is Neo-Pythagorean, which is it's a scholarly term to refer to the ways in which Pythagorean philosophy evolved during the first and second and third century CE, where Pythagoreanism blended with Platonism. And when you get to Neoplatonism, there's a lot of Neo-Pythagorean elements in it. But Neo-Pythagoreanism also had a very strong component that was lifestyle based. So there was emphasis on abstaining from animal meat, on abstaining from alcohol, and all sorts of ascetic practices, and an idea of almost like a mysticism to these practices, so ability to access some mystical abilities through these practices. So he may have very well had a following of students, but definitely not, or most likely not, a cult following.
So he wasn't a Mithras. That's what I was trying. That was the
Yeah,
name I
yeah,
was
yeah.
reaching for. He was just a philosophy teacher, for lack of a better term.
Right. He was
Now, oh, go
the
ahead.
term we could use is holy man. And the characteristic, and we find this in both Christian and Greek and Roman literature, this figure who is itinerant, does miracles or exorcisms, and preaches, for lack of a better word, a certain kind of philosophy.
So one of the things that I kind of wanted to stay on now that we've gotten into it is when I was getting ready for this episode, I tried to watch some other podcasts about Apollonius, and I about just figuratively shot myself in the head because it seemed to devolve into a big argument about, well, he's not Jesus, and everybody who tries to compare him is wrong. And then you'd have these like neo-pagans who are like, he's just like Jesus. And it was really kind of annoying, for lack of a better term, because I didn't feel like I was learning anything about him as a figure. So I'm just curious, the narrative about Apollonius, has it primarily stayed in this Jesus academic context, or is it evolving in some fashion?
Um, so starting in about the 18th or 19th century, Apollonius was brought up a lot by theologians, German theologians particularly, in trying to understand Jesus. So I think it's in the late 19th or early 20th century where you have this hypothesis called the Theos Aner, or the godlike man hypothesis. And what that hypothesis posits is that in trying to make Jesus accessible to Greek and Roman audiences, the gospel writers modeled Jesus on this Greek and Roman type known as the Theos Aner, the godlike man. Now, this thesis played a huge role in the continuing use of Jesus, use of Apollonius in talking about Jesus. You could look at any introduction to the New Testament textbook, and inevitably you will find something about Apollonius of Tyana mentioned as a way to explain Jesus within within that particular historical context. I don't find any of that useful because that relies more on the later reception of Apollonius, and also one of the biggest faults of the Theos Aner hypothesis was that there's a list of characteristics that the Theos Aner has, but the only two people who have all of those characteristics are Apollonius and Jesus. So it's not doesn't seem to be a term. It's not a term that really exists in the Greek literature itself. But that said, I still think it is interesting. And this is what the second reason I got interested in Philostratus' Apollonius is the ways in which the miracles of Apollonius, exorcisms and healings, and also he has the ability to travel like instantaneously, but exorcism and healings and his kind of, philosophy it's a little communitarian in orientation. All of that is found in the Synoptic Gospels, at least. Jesus's two major things he does is heal and exercise, and the rest of it is his own philosophy. So I think there is something in terms of like, okay, there's a common type in happening in the Mediterranean world, but Jesus predates Apollonius. So it makes no sense to use Apollonius to understand Jesus. And especially when you're using Philostratus' biography, which is 2 centuries after Jesus.
So tell us how you got into studying Apollonius. What was it that brought you to him? Because I find him to be an interesting figure because there's all this mystery about him and you don't really know a whole lot about him. But what led you to him?
Well, so again, kind of going to the road I took that got me here. When I was in graduate school, I was actually in India reading just some novel, and it mentioned this guy named Megasthenes, and I was like, wait a minute, that's a Greek name. And so I got really interested in the idea of, well, what did the Greeks know about India? And so I started in a Greek history seminar, diving into that more. And one thing that I discovered was this tradition of philosophers going east. And Greg Wolfe, who's a Roman historian, happened to be visiting Penn, and he just offhandedly asked me, well, have you read Philostratus' Apollonius? I was like, no. And so I read it, and several things happened. One, the first major part of the story is about Apollonius's travels to India to study with Brahmins. That was one part. So a lot of, like, the first 3 books is all about that journey, and then all about the time he spends with the Indian Brahmins. The second thing was, I was raised Christian. My dad was a minister. When I read Philostratus' Apollonius, I read it and I was like, this reads a lot like a gospel. And that was my own kind of like Christian background and Christian upbringing that made me see that. But as I dug, so I spent, a couple of semesters really digging in to Apollonius, and it ended up becoming my dissertation because I was interested in how Philostratus managed to take this individual with a very negative reputation as we see in Cassius Dio and Lucian, and make him into someone that in the Historia Augusta becomes almost like almost like a divine figure. How did that happen? And so, and Philostratus's biography of Apollonius is the longest biography that survives from antiquity. It's 8 books, so 2 lobed volumes. And I got, I got interested, and that's really when I started really getting interested in religion as well as a discipline. And it seemed everything went back to 2 things. And those 2 things were Apollonius traveled east, and Apollonius had this kind of divinatory ability. He had foreknowledge. Those were the 2 reasons why that Philostratus identifies as why Apollonius has a negative reputation. And so that became the focus of my dissertation, is how does Philostratus defend Apollonius and kind of accomplish this conversion, this transformation.
Your discussion of him going to India, Apollonius going to India, reminded me of Dr. Strange, but that's a side quest that we don't necessarily need to get into. And it just confirms for me, though, that there's no new ideas. We just keep recycling the same thing over and over. One thing, though, you mentioned was that Apollonius came in a little bit after Jesus. Can you just give us the time period that he was active?
Yeah, we can't give a as clear a time period as we can with Jesus. Apollonius is, it was a 1st century date, probably somewhere in the early-ish 1st century to the time of Domitian. It seems like his, if we follow Philostratus, his biggest activity was between the time of Nero and Domitian. So that was probably part of his public career. So I think we can kind of speculate that Apollonius was born towards the end of Jesus's life. But he was born in a very different culture, because Jesus was born in a Second Temple Jewish culture, and Apollonius was born in a Roman imperial culture.
And that's a wide berth to be around from Nero to Domitian and survive all that. That was a rough time. So,
Yeah.
A couple other things that I want to talk to you about. What brought about? Well, let me kind of save that for a minute here. But one thing that I was interested in your article that I read was the discussion about how philosophy in antiquity is more similar to religion as we think of it today. Can you explore that a little bit? I know that's a broad topic, but
yeah. So now the whole question of how do you define religion is another one of these. Well, let me point you to a whole wing of the library for you to read up on it. But if we think about our modern kind of everyday understanding of religion, we think of a few characteristics. 1, there's some kind of central figure, right? 2, there's some kind of central text. And 3, this figure in this text tells you how to live your life. So those are like 3 big parts. We could also think about like evangelizing as a part of religion, proselytizing as a part of religion. And this, especially with monotheism, this inability to be more than one religion, right? You can't be a Muslim and Christian at the same time, because, well, Islam does recognize Jesus, but in Islam, Jesus is a prophet. And Islam is very, the Quran is very, speaks extensively about not associating people with God. And Christians who associate Jesus with God as the Son of God are wrong, right? So there tends to be these really clear theological lines between religions, right? Now, in antiquity, when we usually think of religion in antiquity, we think of Zeus and the Olympian gods. We might think of mystery cult. We might think of just all the temples to various gods. And those things don't actually correlate to our kind of everyday understanding of religion, because those things were focused more on what we could say call orthopraxy, doing things the right way. What matters is doing the ritual the right way. There's not an orthodoxy, like there's not a set of beliefs that a person has to assent to engage in the worship of any of these gods. Philosophy, on the other hand, does match all of those descriptors. Philosophy, the various philosophical schools have founders. So there's Plato for the Platonists, and Zeno for the Stoics, and Pythagoras for the Pythagoreans, Aristotle for the Peripatetics. So there's the founder figure. There's a collection of authoritative texts. So these are the writings, that founding figure. There's a lifestyle associated with these various schools of philosophy. So for like Apollonius and Neo-Pythagoreans, there is this ascetic lifestyle that's very clearly connected to the philosophy. And the last two things is, well, these philosophical schools actually did proselytize and tried to get people to see the value of their particular philosophy and to adhere to it. And finally, you can't be, most of these philosophies contradict each other. So you couldn't, for example, be a Platonist and a Stoic at the same time. Stoics think that everything is material. Platonist thinks the material world is an illusion, right? So you have these kind of clear philosophical lines that prevent you from being both at the same time. Now, let me put an asterisk by that and say that, well, of course, there are still ways in which these different philosophical schools are interacting with each other and influencing each other in the same way that we could say that various religions interact and influence each other. So yeah, so when you get to the period of the Roman Empire, the philosophical schools of Greece are the closest thing we have that looks like what we consider to be religion.
So, because I know you're a comics guy, to wrap up on Apollonius, you live long enough, you either die a hero or you live long enough to become the villain. I may be butchering that quote from the Dark Knight movies, but tell us a little bit about how poor Apollonius met his fate.
Are you talking about the death of Apollonius, or?
Right.
Yeah,
The
so
mystery, I'm a big, I love Western movies, and I love The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is one of my all-time favorite movies, and that line, this is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. So just
right.
take the most entertaining version of it and go with that.
Well, according to Philostratus, Apollonius just disappeared. That's it. He just disappeared. So
was he on trial though at that point?
So in Philostratus's biography, he was on trial again under Domitian for fomenting revolution and there's other things that come up about him associating with these Easterners, which kind of make you a magician and an untrustworthy con man. And what Philostratus says, he explains that how Apollonius got acquitted, but then he includes this really, really long speech of defense. He says that Apollonius did write a speech of the defense that he was going to deliver, but he didn't have to. But here it is. Here's the whole speech, and that makes up the majority of Book 8. And after Apollonius makes the speech, he disappears from Domitian's court, reappears. I want to say in Agi, and then disappears again.
So he pulls a Batman. He's just gone. Just
Yeah.
just up and leaves. Nobody can find him.
Suddenly leaves. No one knows. No one knows what happened. But Philostratus says that there are places that are devoted to him, to Apollonius. He talks about finding. He says that people have gotten Apollonius all wrong, and I'm going to set the record straight. And what I did was I traveled to all those special places where people venerated Apollonius, and I got all the material they had about him. And I listened to all the stories they told, and I got all these other written documents about him. And I'm going to put it all together and give you like the definitive account of Apollonius. And the definitive account doesn't include death.
Okay. Is there any sort of resurrection kind of myth associated with him, or he's just gone?
He's gone. I mean,
It's
when
awesome.
he disappears from Domitian's court, they're like, what? Where'd he go? I think the Batman, the Batman analogy might be appropriate. There are like, Philostratus at the end mentions a few different like theories. Some say he died in Ephesus, for example, but there's no proof of any of these theories of his death. And so we're left with he disappeared.
Well, it's still a great way to exit. It's hard to beat that. But sticking on the comic book element here, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is you have a book out, Theology in the DC Universe. Can you tell us just a little bit about that as far as what it covers, just kind of an elevator speech about it?
Yeah, so it started with myself and a colleague who teaches in the area as well, who started a series called Theology and Pop Culture, right? And DC Comics happened to be something that I and another individual are very passionate about. So we decided to put this together. And it covers a lot of different areas of DC Comics, both things from like the movie unit, the cinematic universe, as well as things from the comics, and also things from Vertigo, which is a secondary press of DC Comics that tended towards more mature titles and things that tended to have a lot of occult in them. And some of the papers look at various theological ideas and how it plays through in certain comics. For example, there's an article that looks at millennial, I'm going to mess up the word, let's just say millennialism and the Legion of Superheroes. But then we also have an article that looks at how the story of Heracles is used in Wonder Woman stories, right? So it's kind of a classicist kind of approach to reading the comics. And we have more kind of straight up philosophy, theology work. One of the main things we wanted in this book was we wanted to avoid anything that disconnected the characters from the actual comics, in the sense that like we didn't want anything where it's like Superman is this and Superman is that. We always want to say, okay, what book are you reading and how are you interpreting? It has to connect to us because there are many different versions of all of these stories, as you are probably aware. Uh, so we didn't want any of those kind of grand narrative statements that are not based in the actual material, but based in a kind of feel. Um, so yeah, that's pretty much the story behind it. Um, I actually wasn't able to include an article in the series, in the book, because of just other things in my life. Didn't have really the bandwidth to do it, but it was a fun project to edit and to see all the different ways people are thinking about DC Comics.
Well, you could do a lot on John Constantine alone,
Yeah,
probably his own book. He's a great character. I would be curious to see if you could find a way to fit Jonah Hex into that. He always seems like an outlier character that's underutilized and
yeah,
probably should have his own show on HBO Max. But his one of his origin stories as a Confederate soldier who realized he was fighting for the wrong side is
yeah.
a little problematic, to be polite about it, as far as how to portray that. But nonetheless, an interesting character.
In a way, Jonah Hex, and this is, I'm just spitballing now that you mentioned Jonah Hex, the Confederate soldier who realizes he's fighting for the wrong side and then goes traveling around uh, righting wrongs. That sounds a lot like the Phantom Stranger, uh, who is also based on this early Christian kind of anti-Semitic idea of the wandering Jew. Usually, the idea that Judas wanders around, realizing he had done wrong and um, is trying to atone for that for all eternity. So,
Yeah, and Jonah Hex, not to side quest too much, but he has a very strict code and he does not hesitate to enforce it, no matter how violent that may be. But if
mm,
you do what he perceives as wrong, which actually probably ethically usually is the wrong thing to have
mm.
done, he will make you pay for it. Again,
That
if
that also sounds like the Spectre, the spirit of vengeance, which was supposed to be God's vengeance on Earth, another DC character um, that I've long wanted to spend some time, like really getting into and analyzing.
So basically, what we're saying here, to sum up this part of the discussion, is if James Gunn is listening to this, we're giving you great ideas for a TV show, an ongoing series. You got
Oh yeah,
Max or HBO Max, I still call it that. Just make it. You got content you need to fill. So anyway,
right. Just let's get a series about Jonah Hex and the Phantom Stranger wandering through the DC world and righting wrongs.
you could do what they did in I can't remember if it was the New 52 or what came after that, but where they basically tied Jonah Hex into Gotham's origin story.
Yeah, that was in New 52, right?
Right. And then you get Gotham by Gaslight. The
Mhm.
possibilities are endless here.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
again, James Gunn, if you're listening, give us producer credits. We're good. So anyway, a couple last things I wanted to cover with you here. What is a good book to read? What would you recommend to us? Give us a homework assignment.
A good book to read about classics, about anything,
Anything, anything.
anything. Uh, so I have a few different recommendations. I just finished reading Opus, and I'm forgetting the author's name, but it's the subtitle is The Cult of Dark Money, Human Trafficking, and something else. Sorry, this is not good form here. I can't even remember the full title, but it's about a group within the Catholic Church called Opus Dei, and it's been around since the early 20th century, and it's a very far right-wing conservative group, originally supported by the Franco regime in Spain. Yeah. Um, and it talks about how the amount of power they got within the Catholic Church and then the frightening amount of influence they've had on American politics, including in the most recent Supreme Court justice's uh, appointment. So it is kind of a depressing story in that sense, um, but it's also fascinating to see like this whole world that exists, and a lot of it was in the DC area where I'm located. This whole world, it was almost like a cult within the Catholic Church. Uh, Pope Francis has done a lot of work to depower them, but Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II really liked them because they saw in Opus Dei some conservative allies. So that was a fascinating book. Uh, the other book I'll recommend is Home Fire by Camilla Shamsi. It's a work of fiction. And I read it thinking about my class for next semester. It is based off the Antigone, but it's set in 21st century England. And it's about a Muslim family. And the son of the Muslim family gets wrapped up in extremism, and his sisters trying to bring him back, right? So it has this kind of connection to the Antigone that I thought was really fun and interesting, and just a good novel, and a great way to see how classics is still resonating.
Okay. And I'm going to, because I just don't have the energy on a Sunday to comment on my profession, skip what I would want to say about some of the members of the Supreme Court. Just going to keep on walking. What I'm going to do. I'm going to stay in my lane today. Save that for later.
Yeah, well, I have a wide range of interests, so
There's a lot there that would occupy your time. Anyway, okay. So give us another podcast episode topic. I'm not promising it will happen, but I will at least try to make it happen.
well, I'll give you a couple. One, if we're sticking with the classics topic, is the Second Sophistic. And Philostratus was writing during the Second Sophistic. It's a really interesting time where, I had mentioned these sophists who travel around and give oratorical speeches and give advice to um, government and emperors. And it's also a time of deep nostalgia because, the Greeks are clearly under the Roman Empire now. And there's the continuing nostalgia for the time of Alexander or the time of 5th century Greece, when Greece was at its strongest point. So Second Sophistic would be an interesting topic. I also find ancient religion the interesting topic, especially divination. Divination is fascinating. It's the one topic that gets more philosophical commentary than any other kind of thing connected with religion. Um, and then for funsies, I have to say DC Comics.
I think we can make that last one work at some point. That will be a good topic. And thank you for passing all of those along. Gives me a lot of reading assignments and things to look at. Thank you so much, Dr. Abraham, for coming on. I really appreciate your time and your willingness to respond to an email out of the blue from me. And hopefully you will come back on one day and we can talk a little bit more about some of the mythology behind comic books and comic stories. It's just a great topic. It's interesting. It's always fun to discuss, and it does elevate what we think of generally as kid stories to a whole other level. But we can talk about that more at another time. Anyway, folks, you know where to find us, bullcitycoordinators.com. I am no longer on Twitter for Antiquity Pod. It is Blue Sky and also Mastodon at Antiquity Pod. All the other socials at Duke FB Coverage. Send me an email, bullcitycoordinators@gmail.com. Give me a call with a comment, question, any concerns or thoughts you have, 540-632-0160. You can get on the podcast. I will play messages if we get them. And as you all know, I'm still lining up future podcast episodes, future topics, future areas of discussion. And I have to keep doing that because, as we know, the Classical Antiquity Sidequest is a podcast without end.